Hello. I think we're going to get started here. Just going to introduce, we have two panels today, Alex and Ben. And thank you, Alex and Entreprov, for putting this on. And a huge thank you to Atlas Workbase and Jason back there for hosting. I'm going to go ahead and I guess pass it on, let you guys really introduce yourself and what you're working on. Tell us what you're working on in your background.
Yeah, let's make sure we get this right. So my name is Alex Brooks. I'm the founder of Entreprov. We basically do custom predictive analytics and automation solution software to help companies improve decision making and enhance performance. That's a lot of like words just kind of scrambled all into one. All that means is we build tools that help companies make better decisions using data. So we've spent the past several months in the tourism space. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with like all the giant 40-passenger buses that are going around the city right now. Raise your hand if you are. So we've been spending a lot of time building pricing tools for them, helping them effectively come up with good prices for customers. So we're in that space, and we recently just transitioned into retail. So, and that's part of the inspiration behind starting the discussion panel that's focused on retail.
Oh, yeah. Okay, hello. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. It doesn't sound like. My name is Ben Rogajan. I have been working in analytics and data science for probably the last 5-6 years. Everything really from healthcare to social media to like e-commerce. And I've done everything from things like developing algorithms for fraud detection and wastage in healthcare, e-commerce more like pricing. I've also done a lot of training for specific companies. They've everything from like R and ARIMA modeling to Python and healthcare analytics in that general range. So that's mostly been focusing specifically on like fraud detection and also kind of seeing how that can be used. Similar models can be used in other applications besides just healthcare. So that's been my focus.
Yeah, so what was I gonna say? I really wanted to just kind of start a discussion about like some very how many are any of you guys in retail? All right, so all right, raise your hand. You're in retail. You're in retail, and how many came here just for data analytics, machine learning? That's what I figured. So kind of, and I'll go back to my point, the inspiration around putting together this discussion panel is just focused on really basic tips on how retail owners can get more engaged. Because if you guys are in retail, you may understand, depending on what companies you're at, how a lot of basic things are skipped over, just like doing segmentation, specific type of targeted marketing. So we wanted to use this discussion panel to kind of share tips on how, not customers, but how retail owners can, utilize basic tools to be able to just improve their customer engagement. So. Hold on just a second. Just. Any questions that you have that spark up? Do you want me to share that? Just get. All right, I'll do that. Give us just a moment. Testing. Can you hear me? So what were you going to ask, Sage? Okay. So the past like several months, we've been working with a series of local retail companies in the area, and one of the things that we notice, and it's a simple process, is just basic segmentation. So if you have a company where you have customers that are both locally and nationally, like other parts of the country, uh, just being able to send specific targeted messaging to them based on the location that they're in is important. And we've noticed that a lot of companies, and I'm not really listing names, but we've noticed a lot of companies send general emails out to companies regardless of their location. So, for example, like this local event, if I have, if I was running an event and it was a training event, I wouldn't send emails to people out in Washington, D.C. or like Toronto, Canada. And one of the things that we noticed that was very simple, a lot of companies were just sending general emails out about local events, and it wasn't really relevant to them. And that's not really so much machine learning, but it's just simple segmentation where you can do some analytics if you're collecting data on their, name, address, and, contact information. You can do some simple, analysis and determine whether or not you should send an email to a person, based on their location. So.
It really doesn't sound like it's on. Just to kind of add to that, I think I brought up this point before where it's not just like, because I get sick and tired of certain emails that I get from, I always use the example of Men's Warehouse, where it's like just a general blast of, hey, this is on sale. And it's like, that's great. But a lot of these companies keep track of pretty much everything I buy, to the point where I don't even realize that you've paid attention to that information. And so I'm almost surprised that like none of that information is used, not again, like just used to help me out. So I always think like, how can a company, be helpful to me? Not necessarily sell me something, but be helpful. Be like, how can it provide a service with that data that I don't already provide for myself? Like I'm terrible at dressing myself, so why not help me find clothes that I could pair with things I already have owned, is kind of an example I always give people, because it's like some of us don't like planning what we wear, and that's things like Stitch Fix. But there are more modern companies that don't, or not modern, older companies that don't seem to do it, like Brooks Brothers and Men's Warehouse, and they all have that information. They all have this pretty basic information that they could then use to apply models and build things where it's like, hey, we know that person X owns this color suit, and we know this color suit goes with, a blue undershirt, and he doesn't own it yet. And, it's been 6 months since he's bought a previous undershirt. Maybe he'd like it. And so kind of focusing more on that, where it's like, especially for retailers, it's like you could really focus on trying to think of what I need at that time. I get Amazon always tries to seem to sell you the thing that you've already looked at, but it's also like trying to figure out maybe your need before you know it is always the way I try to think. Like, 'cause that's kind of a service in a way. Like, hey, if I don't have to think, like you're winning, right? Like if you're giving me some convenience and giving me confidence in what I'm going to wear, I'm probably going to purchase that thing. So figuring out ways to kind of think ahead of the customer is always where I kind of think about models and like how the user is going to experience it. I can get stuck in like the engineering side too much, I think. So sometimes it's hard to kind of think that way, but I know that definitely once you start thinking that way and building algorithms that start pushing more of the people side and less of the, here are the raw numbers, ignore how the people are going to interact with it, it doesn't always work the way you want. So sometimes when you think about more of the people and how are they going to use this, how is this going to actually help them, I think can kind of benefit you when you're developing kind of models or just a new product that you're trying to push out from a data science or machine learning standpoint. Oh.
There's a ton. That's a great question. So there's a ton of companies that are doing it. But the problem is it's at the high level, not high level, but the big companies like Amazon. And when you think about Google or you think about Facebook, companies that have a lot of money and a lot of resources, and they've taken a long time to collect relevant data. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of exactly how Facebook kind of, collected all the data that they've done over the years. But a lot of companies have, bigger companies have spent a lot of time collecting structured data, performing processes where they clean it. So they're in position for that. The challenge with a lot of medium-sized businesses is they haven't been doing that, and they haven't been collecting the structured data. But on the flip side, they hear about the stories of big companies like Amazon, Microsoft and Google, and they want to emulate that. But the problem is the process is the foundation. They haven't built the foundation to get to that point. So, you know,
of course, yeah.
And that's what I was just saying with Facebook. I definitely think there's a creepy factor, but I don't think it's completely because of lack of money. I think it's the lack of awareness in cutting edge technology. Like, I mean, obviously, companies like Amazon has really been pushing. They've been pushing, technology like this for a very long time. So a lot of people haven't known about it in terms of like medium-sized businesses. So where Amazon is at, or another big company is, they've been preparing for these type of technologies to emerge for a long time. So as it does emerge and the capabilities do become available, then the first people to take advantage of it, unfortunately, are the bigger companies. So. Hopefully not.
Yeah. So that's kind of my thought, and especially trying to push that towards not just like having to go in person, but really trying to focus that online. Like if you can start, it's much easier I think for people to buy things online because it's so almost unreal. As terrible as that is, you think about it from the one reason I enjoy healthcare is because I tell myself I'm actually trying to help something. But companies like Amazon, where they're trying to basically upsell you like a car salesman of an extra product, is that helpful? Maybe not, but so yeah. But that's kind of the concept. Like if you can make it easier for them to just click the button and buy something, you're winning, right? Like that's kind of the sad reality goal. Is it creepy? Sometimes. I think when me and Alex started talking about this conversation, we're like, okay, so whenever anyone does a data science project or starts coming up with innovative things, they need to come up with 3 like basic metrics. 1, is it innovative? 2, is it creepy? And then like 3, could this be racist? Like it's like those 3 things where it's like you kind of have to think when you're doing data science, because like those, like it's very black and white where it's like, can someone be creeped out? I think the flip side is the farther we go along in technology and the more we get used to it, the more we're acclimated to it, and the more we're just going to kind of be like, fine, you help me out, it's okay. And then my other point, going on, like, do companies, are some of them just, do they not have the basically capital or budget for it? I see a lot of very similar things in healthcare too, because healthcare is always that we're way behind, right? Like their focus is not technology, right? Like a company like Google or Amazon, technology is their bread and butter. It's how they make money. Like they don't have an option but to be really good at data, because that's how they've basically made money. A company like Google survives on how well their algorithms work and things on that nature, whereas a healthcare organization does not. Like that's not their optimal way of surviving, right? Like they're just trying to keep people alive, and data and anything else is just tertiary, right? Like it's like, well, if we can do it, if we have budget for it, fine, but if we can't, we're not going to spend it. And now they're, like Alex said, a lot of them are trying to find money to do this, and they're trying to do it too fast, and then they fail, and they've spent millions of dollars on something that wasn't successful because, they're trying to go faster than they should, and they're not realizing, it's kind of like that DC Marvel thing where DC realized what Marvel was doing and started like 5 years too late, and now it's like we have a terrible DC universe. Whereas Marvel, they've spent time, they've planned it out, they knew exactly what they were going to do, and that's why you watch Marvel movies and be like, wow, why is this so much better? And it's like, well, they just thought it through. Like, also, you had a question. I feel like you're like quietly raising hands.
Pregnancy.
Yeah. 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 Opt-in. Yeah. I think definitely like, what's your actual name? David. David just said, opt-in, opt-out is one option.
Yeah.
Another option is, it kind of comes down to like, how helpful is it? Like, is it really helpful and something worth, or is it not? So that's kind of that point. I remember, I think it was like 3 years ago, when I left my location on for my phone, and after driving to my job for like 3 weeks, suddenly I see this a message on my phone saying, hey, if you leave right now from work, you'll get home in 45 minutes. And I'm like, I told you neither of what those locations were, but you've obviously figured it out because I was in location X and location Y during normal work hours. And I don't know how helpful it was to me. So that's one of those things where it's like more creepy than helpful. So I think there's a balancing scale, and then obviously opt in, opt out is also a great way to do it.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I agree. It's ironic that I'm in data and I get creeped out by a lot of things that I'm like, oh, I don't like that. But I think for every company, they really have to take time to really visit their morals and values and what is crossing the line. I mean, you go back, and I'm not trying to throw Facebook under the bus, but you go back to that scenario of where they're at now because of some things they've done over the past couple of years. Just really just sitting down and evaluating, how is this going to play out? What's the risk involved, and is it really worth it? How is this going to impact the future of the company? I think it's hard to figure out what the fine line is because every individual has their own opinion of what a fine line is. So for companies, I mean, they just have to do the best they can to just figure out what's the line that they won't cross, and really press that down throughout the organization of being consistent with that. So that's hard.
Oh.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so what I've suggested and what I've noticed, so a lot of, small and medium-sized companies, they use tools like Stripe or what's another? I can't think of another. Square. And those tools already collect certain amounts of transaction data, like at least the name, at least the product that they purchased, and a timestamp, and maybe an email or an address. I mean, that's enough to really, build some robust tools, or at least learn enough about your customer where you're not sending them the wrong emails about an event here in Seattle and they don't live here, so I would say for like a lot of small, medium, that's companies, that's a really good starting point. And I know you guys may hate me for what I'm about to say. Starting with Excel, like some companies aren't even there where they're not extracting their data where they can even look at it. At least take some time to extract it into an Excel file. And I mean, if you can't do that, hire somebody that can extract it and actually do some real analysis on it and just kind of figure out, what are the trends? What's your average purchase price? Maybe what's a certain time of day where people normally purchase things? What's your most sold product? So I'm really surprised. I'm surprised, like over the past several months, some of the companies that I work with, that they don't do a lot of that, and a lot of it's a guessing game, and they don't have to because they have tools like Stripe or Square that's collecting at least that much data. So.
Shopify actually asks you for your birthday in such a way that they incentivize you by giving you something on your birthday to make you feel good, but at the same time they've gotten your demographic right off the bat, which person belongs to millennial, that's et cetera, but that's how they do it.
You gonna ask a question?
Yeah, you mentioned about how having an opting out less. Has anybody really looked at some of those privacy features that don't offer them, like talk about Facebook does not bother have you looked at just having an opt out but having it defaulted to opt in? Does that make a difference in how much data you collect? My guess is most people out there are too lazy to take advantage of those tools. And yet if the opt-out option is offered, then you mitigate the preview factor. That probably really loses a lot of data. And I was wondering if anyone really looked to try to quantify how much that would make a difference.
I get the point. What was the question that you were curious about?
Companies don't bother because they'd rather just collect all the data, but if you offer some privacy tools and opting out, things like that, but defaulted to what defaults like,
I think it's a form of protection too, and the reason I say that, the GDPR has not, it is affecting everywhere, but I feel like they're going to eventually implement it here. And I mean, if you have customers internationally, you might as well just follow by those rules anyway, because it just takes too much time to segment between who is really a European resident and who's not. But I think it's good to at least have those kind of privacy, check boxes or whatever on your website or however you're collecting data, just to let people know that you are collecting this data and, an idea of how you're storing it. I just think, and this is maybe going off topic a little bit. I think, with the GDPR going into effect, which if you guys aren't familiar with a high level understanding of what it is basically if you're a European citizen officially, and if you come here to the States and go to any store, any of those stores that you go to, they have to follow by certain rules, and they have to report how they're storing your data, and they have to have a system for if you request as a customer or a client to get rid of that data, they have to abide by that. And if they don't, they could get a pretty hefty fine as a percentage of all their global sales. So I know that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I really think it just makes sense to at least communicate that to people that's going to your site or purchasing products, where you're collecting data. So yes. The surprise.
Because, like you said, GDPR is in effect. It's gonna. I hope that. That's, but I think it's gonna be important for everybody to what happens with that, because all companies start handle all. I hope all.
Yeah, I mean, it really affects everybody, because think about it. If you're a business owner and you get any customer that's from Europe and they're European residents, are you really going to take the time to like separate and figure out who's actually a European resident versus not? That's a headache. So why not just start working on a format and a process that works for European residents as well as here? Be honest about how you're not sharing, but collecting data and where you're storing it with everybody. And that way it'll save you a lot of money and a lot of time down the road. So
I just have a lot of comments about this.
we're actually, let me pass it around. I'm gonna start passing.
Sorry. Thanks. We might be thinking something creepy today, but that might become normal in the future. Like Facebook had news feed when it first came out. People were thinking that it is too creepy that whatever they are sharing, it is going to all their friends. And later on, it became very common, and people accepted it as part of normal thing than a privacy thing. And I guess most of the things what we are discussing now, that to be too private, might become something normal in the future, part of essential to be what the world is going to be.
Oh, I thought I saw someone else. Someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's say.
Yeah. So your question or your curiosity. Okay.
Mm. Yeah.
I actually might be that person that would literally opt out of something and probably buy more.
Yeah.
You have like, your 7, 8, your passive. Those are people who are actually loyal to you anyhow. They don't like being bombarded with advertising. They'll still advertise, they'll still purchase from you, but they don't like being advertised. We'd actually maybe lose people like that because of the fact that they're opting out, but still purchasing.
That's kind of me. I'm like that guy.
Correlation there is.
That's why I think having the opt-out thing is not right. They're kind of advertising.
They just don't tell me your fucking data.
What? I think the other way there is just like that's where you start incentivizing, right? Like going back to like Men's Warehouse. Men's Warehouse gives you a $50 off if you spend $500. It's a great way. Like, well, you have to keep track of your phone number, otherwise, now we can track you because we have your phone number. Or same thing with their gift from Shopify or anything like that. It's like in a weird way, some companies are already paying for our data, right? Like as long as there's incentive, we almost give in. I give that example for like why certain companies, like let's say Netflix, are so good at data is because we were always incentivized to give them the right information, right? Like if you wanted the right movie next, you were incentivized to be like, I want movie, whatever, because I want it. And so always creating that incentives kind of is part of it, right? Because then you don't have to think about classifying your data. Then you don't have to think about spending all this time on things that are really costly because Netflix, like, no, we already have our data classified. The people classified it, Same thing with Facebook, right? Like we went through and did the face, like, oh, this is my face here, right? All they did was at first was like, this is a face. Is this you? Is this your friend? Oh, I'll just start typing it in. And then you would manually go in and tell it which face it was. And you were the one classifying that data for them. And so honestly, like if you incentivize people to have a reason to do things like classify data or give you data, basically, they're going to be much more inclined. So that's the other part I think that companies are struggling with is like, okay, now how do we, get people to give us this data without feeling like they're giving us this data, right? So that's the other side is that people side. It's not just, again, models. Like, okay, how do we actually get them to give this data without feeling bad about it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, when you, not to sidetrack, when you think about business, it's all about value. And if you're providing a service and you're just trying to give a customer the best experience you possibly can, and you communicate that to them and explain, here's some things that I think we could use to help create a better experience for you. Can you help us by helping us help you, pretty much? So.
Customer experience, they actually find customer experience more than price. Some people are actually wanting to opt in anyhow because of the fact that like, or how can you help them? How can I help you to help me? People are actually buying in.
Yep.
So, how do you feel that discussion that we're having about privacy impacts the ability to track customers during the life journey?
No, I think that's a great question. I think it kind of it almost kind of piggybacks off of the discussion we're having right now. I think it's really important to be transparent. Be transparent as much as possible, and have that conversation with your customer, regardless if it's just like, in text, or if it's a situation where they come in and visit. Explain it to them like, hey, we want to give you the best experience we possibly can. Here's some of the things that we could use to help do that for you. And I was talking about this example earlier because it's something that just keeps sticking in my head. So there's a cafe around here. It's called Cafe Solstice. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to it. Yeah. Great food, by the way. The great food, very great ambiance. And I'm going to tell on myself a little bit. They have these oatmeal raisin cookies, and they have like dinners and stuff like that. But every time I go there, there's always a question in my head right on the way in, like, do I get an oatmeal raisin cookie? Or I'm like, no, I kind of had too many sweets earlier. I'm going to lay off of it. But I was saying in my head, and I thought to myself the last time I went there, if they had some data on like my past purchase history, and even if I purchased lunch and they just brought up like, hey, I mean, we just thought you like an oatmeal raisin cookie. What do you think about this? We put it in the microwave. For me, it'd be 100% sale. So like, I'm not going to turn that down, even if I'm like on the fence of like, oh, I'm not going to do it today. So I think, but prior to that is, just having that conversation, initially, help us help you. And I think that would open the door to be able to have that experience where you can track from start to finish that life cycle of that customer. So I think that little piece of communicating is just very important.
To Alex's point too, I think a lot of people get kind of turned off, but you can get rid of any person without annoying them, really still use those analytics. A lot of useful that was kind of processing, even myself personally, what do I consider 5%, not especially talk about the retail, but personally, hey, all right, when I purchase something, know what I purchase, okay, I know how frequently I come. I guess I don't see those necessarily. I see, I think that
Yeah.
I'm giving that information every time I buy something. So I guess there's that balance of talk about Facebook. I work in so I'm translating. Okay, just give you context.
Yeah.
And actually, for a little bit about my background, I actually started 5 years ago. I started called prospect. It's doing the research on individual donors to be able to do all publicly available information. Stuff that anyone can get. I was trained on how to get it. Does that make sense? And so I understand the creep factor. I balance that with our context. I don't point into it. Does that make sense? So I guess if I think about even from the retail space, I don't see a lot of the data that we would use or to do the journey necessarily. Does that make sense? And so I think there's a lot that we could do that we kind of have this past Seattle Times University. So that means they publish an absolute day, we need your stuff. If this got put on Seattle Times, it's okay. So anyway, I guess I just share that just kind of give that perspective. I think customer journey is so important. And so we don't want to so hinder ourselves because especially in our business, it's about relationships. Cultivate that relationship with the organization, no matter what it is. Whatever you think. So find that balance. But they expect, hey, they should know I like this, right? They should know what the art director. They should know if something like this is personal. That's that. Right? That's that balance. So I guess I come back to you. That kind of asks that question. What
So I think that's a really good question. And this is where you can get a little creative with it. I mean, just add on address. I mean, what part of town a person lives in. And this is kind of more of an indirect approach. What we did with the client a couple months ago is kind of looking at the seasonality factor, the tourism factor. Like, you know, you have a lot of visitors that come here in the summer and they do cruises or they go to events, looking at, you know, the foot traffic in certain areas throughout the year. I mean, like in the summer, you know, there's cruise ship after cruise ship docked here, and you have all these tourists that come around and go to different shops. Looking outside of your business, looking at those external factors is kind of a creative way to kind of look at adding some more value without being creepy. So
the one funny thing I think, about like address is like you can start. It can sometimes in a weird way teeter, maybe not creepy, but like there's a lot, for instance, like I've read a few papers like on zip code, right? Like zip code can be an interesting confounding variable because you add in, you know, income, you add in, you know, different characteristics about people that are really have a tendency to group into different zip codes because, you know, and so like I actually remember one of the first algorithms I built, I was like, I'll use zip code because I don't have all the incomes. I have some gaps here, and I'll just use zip code and average it out, and that should match. And then, you know, I was younger me, and I started thinking, it's like, wow, that's like a terrible way to start grouping people and expect certain tendencies, and in a weird way, you're blindly causing creepiness without realizing it. And I think that's one of the steps that is harder, especially for, again, data people, is like, we just look at data as numbers. We don't look at data as people. So sometimes we build things and it's like, oh, this seems fine. Like, what's the problem here? And we don't think about what does this number actually represent, right? Like, what does this zip code actually mean? What does it hold inside? And so it's really also thinking about that step, because even when you don't mean to be creepy, you can accidentally start making things that are creepy. Again, like the letter that to the 16-year-old that says, hey, you know, congrats on your pregnancy. Oh, I don't remember what it said exactly, or whatever it might be. You know, it's like you don't even realize you're doing it because you don't 100% understand the data you're working with, right? And so there's that step where you almost need to understand the data you're working with and the actual events that they represent. You know, in healthcare, that's a lot of what I think about. It's like, okay, well, what does this represent? When you see, you know, you see data sometimes that goes in and out, and with healthcare, you're like, well, what am I seeing here? What does this mean? Like in real life, what is transpiring with this data? So that's always something I try to think about, is like, okay, what is this transpiring? How does my algorithm affect the current output? I think that a lot with like fraud and wastage, because sometimes you're like, well, if we tell that these providers are, you know, performing fraud and wastage, but we accidentally mark an okay provider who might have just had some bad tendencies, will they now change their behavior to underperform and underprovide services because they're worried about getting called out? So it's always like, okay, how do we make sure to build this thing and think about the data and think about how the people will react through it all? So, throw the microphone.
Yeah, I'm gonna run it out.
He's gonna run the microphone.
I just had a question about machine learning in retail, and just to provide some context. So what machine learning generally does is try to answer questions that aren't necessarily easy to answer by humans. So, you know, usually you try to program a function to have some inputs, and you provide an output as an answer. And the point of machine learning is that it's a set of algorithms that provide a generalizing function that potentially gives a better answer for mapping that input to output. So with that context of this is a kind of a tool to answer questions, what kind of questions do people have in retail that aren't being adequately answered by sort of the traditional people thinking stuff up model, rather that could potentially be answered by this new set of machine algorithms? Has there been any, so I'm not from retail, so I guess my question is, have people in retail thought about the question in that manner? And what kind of categories can they provide of sort of within that space of questions that they're looking to answer with these new tools? And also maybe to provide some context, so the elephant in the room is Amazon. And my feeling is that Amazon hasn't really even looked into that very much. They've taken on a lot of the lower common denominator problems with back-end logistics, sort of these distribution problems. But I mean, the retail experience is potentially quite a bit more than that. So I get the sense that there's a lot of space to explore that maybe people can talk about.
So like, for instance, one of the things I think of, and I don't, were you here earlier? I don't remember if you were here at the beginning of the talk.
I came in a few minutes late.
Oh, it's fine. I didn't see you, so that's why. Because I just didn't want to give the example over if I'd already said it. So I talked earlier about like Men's Warehouse, and one of the things, like when you go in Men's, does anyone shop at Men's Warehouse? Do you like their sales experience? Like, I don't know if you guys enjoy it. You don't? Like, do you do it by yourself? Do you have the salesperson help you out? I have the salesperson help me out. Yeah. So it's kind of like, if, in a weird way, if they can provide that service before you need it, right? Like, to me, it's like, if they can create an algorithm that basically acts like a salesman, they figure out, once you enter the site, who are you? What are you going to buy? And what does that go with? Like, what is the, I think Stitch Fix allows you to actually even start typing in questions like, what should I wear to a wedding? And, based off what you already have, it provides you kind of some information to say like, oh, here's some stuff you can wear to a wedding. So with retail, it's really about like, well, what does my customer want to buy next? I think is the question I would want to answer, because Amazon, I feel like, answers the question of, what did my customer just buy? And what are similar products like that, right? Like, that's usually what you get. And then also, what are other products that people buy that want this product? And so that's kind of, like you said, kind of the easier thing to say, right? Because you already have that information, right? The harder thing to say is like, based on what my customers bought in the past, what does he need in the future? And I think that's the harder thing to answer, is like, okay, how do we start breaking down people into how frequently they buy? Because I'm sure some people bulk buy, right? Like, some people probably go to a store and buy, 5 dress shirts, 3 ties, whatever. And some people probably just go when they need one thing. And so how do you make sure to provide exactly when the person's going to buy and exactly what they're going to buy at that time? So I think that's, from a business standpoint, those are the questions I want to answer, because that means if I can sell 2 extra ties to a person a year, that equates to, several $1 million over, thousands of people. So I think that's like the basic question that people are missing, because that's what, yeah. Yeah.
So when it comes to Amazon, it's not something like Amazon Go is really not about what's it like to having cashiers experience in the store. It's about actually mapping your behavior to the store over time, aggregate to actually deliver how people actually shop. So the whole thing just makes serving, I feel like this gives you an easy way in, way out, but it's really about serving you, seeing how you go through the space, and actually seeing how you have to decisions, what you pick up, why you put it back down, things like that. Stuff, what you walk in with, walk out with. What you had in your basket, you eventually finally take out. So it's really about looking at the behavior in the state over time, and actually finding ways to actually look at the picture.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, how much of that do you feel like can be templatized and generalized throughout the retail space? For example, you talked about basically a wardrobe. You could think of something similar like a home theater set of things. Mm-hmm. Do you think that sort of a third-party company can develop a more general tool and apply that to various stores? Do you feel like that might be the future for these sort of smaller shops or shops that don't have a lot of, I guess, expensive IT in-house to develop that experience, that a third party can come along and develop something that can drop into a lot of retail experiences?
Go ahead, please.
I think I almost lost my train of thought. I think having a tool for smaller companies that would be able to create that experience would be huge. Because first of all, and I'm not going to generalize, there's a lot of small and medium-sized companies that aren't doing anything in terms of segmentation. And it's partially because of time and just the lack of knowledge and understanding of how to go about doing it. And to be able to have a tool that could maybe, 3x, their sales based off of just small tweaks, or having a tool that, helps with more targeted effort would be huge. And I think In fact, when the first question you had, I had a lot of ideas that I just wanted to just kind of puke out all at once, but I didn't have the mic at the time. But I feel like with retail right now is a great opportunity you're not going to fully replace the in-person experience where you come in and you have a great salesperson who's asking questions and, communicating and smiling and directing you to where you want to go. But I think there's an opportunity to start doing something like that online where I believe it's North Face. I went on their site recently, and what was interesting, when I went on the site, it started to ask me a series of questions like, what do I like to do? And it seemed like it was a decision tree. So based off of one question that I answered, it kind of funneled me into another direction. Before I knew it, it had like an outfit or some hiking gear, preferred. And I think there's a huge opportunity for being able to tap into that world because nobody's done it. So, yeah.
You're good.
So data is really all about data insights. So when it comes to retail, what are the main insights that retailers are actually looking for in these actions from the data?
I think it's, again, one, basically what's future sales going to be like? What are people going to buy in the future? Two, what do they want to buy in the future? Like, what are we not selling that we need to be selling? Is there another product that we don't have or we haven't made that is the next season, right? Because that kind of tends to be a thing. I think also, like, how do we predict the next trend before it happens? And that's huge, right? Like, they're going to make all this stuff. Like, you go somewhere like, Nordstrom, and you see all the stuff in clearance. That's all the stuff that didn't make it. So how do you avoid that? How do you make the things that everyone's going to want and everyone's willing to buy, and you make just enough so you don't have, tons and tons of leftover product? Because one, I think that's sufficient from a business side. You can lower your costs and increase, your revenue, but you can also, reduce wastage and reduce other streams as well. So I think those are the two things I think of is it from a business standpoint, because you're either going to reduce costs or increase sales. Reducing costs kind of come down to either firing people or optimizing things. Whereas, from a customer standpoint, you want to increase sales. So what does that mean? Probably things, again, like knowing what they're going to buy before they buy it, knowing what you need to make to, almost give it to them. I almost have a theory that in the future, we're like, there's going to be a lot less of like, you're almost just going to go online and like create your own shirt, and then they'll just send it to you. Like, it'll be some robot that just automates some nice product for you, like an actual nice product. Because like the t-shirts you can get from some of those sites that you make your own custom t-shirt are okay, but like, like a nice, whatever, it might be a nice blouse. It's like, oh, I want a nice blouse and I want this like this, and these like this is my specific fit, and just have some automated robot that automatically cuts it, sews it, and then ships it to you. And I think that's a way in the future, but I think that's somewhere where it would be very beneficial for everyone involved.
I was gonna add a big question that I've noticed a lot of retailers that I've worked with ask is, how do I just get customers to come back? Literally, how do I get repeat customers? How do I get them to come back? Who should I focus on to try to get them to come back? Those are like some really big questions, and I think it's challenging. Kind of leading on to what he was saying is how do you predict trends? And how do you, seasonality is a little easier to predict, because certain times of the year, like in Seattle, it's going to be nice. Certain times of the year is not going to be as nice. But how do you also predict the trends of what people like? And I think there may be some opportunity of being able to use, image recognition to be able to kind of look at patterns and trends and try to get ahead of the curve. But I think what I've noticed, the biggest question that I hear all the time is like, so we got this event. How do we get people to come back to this event next month? Or how do we get people to buy more stuff at our store? So
I just want to say something really funny. And then there was like 4 hands. I was like, oh no. So just on the trends and image recognition, one of the things I've always thought about, and this is just giving background on me, like in order to pay my way through college, I ended up working in fine dining. And a joke I always made was like, how to tell the trend in fine dining? Like, what's going to happen next? You just look at like the 3 to 4 top restaurants and their Instagrams, and that's where you're going to see the next like trend will be. Like, basically they'll like, I worked at the Arab Farm, so anyone knows that. Like, we were watching Noma, which was the best restaurant in the world for a while there, and like they were doing edible twigs, and we just saw this like fluctuation of every nice restaurant everywhere, every state suddenly start doing edible twigs. It's like everyone's doing edible twigs now. So I'm sure in a similar way, you'll start seeing fashion kind of, you could almost predict fashion in a similar way, like find those specific influencers and be like, well, here are these top 4 or 5 influencers. Clearly we need to make product X. And you it's almost a simple model, right? Like, it's like, you don't even have to make something complex. It's like, just figure out these 5 people. What do they do? Most likely this is going to be the trend for this whole wave of people, right? Because we just have waves of people who follow these influencers, and you're just like, there you go. Okay.
Just to go back to kind of the concept of transaction, you need to collect point of sale data, keeping things simple. Since we've been talking about close months, just keeping track of folks that buy stuff in the store. Hey, I can't remember last time I was here, what's that shirt I bought? You know, that information is really cool. How much better of an experience is that? That's something extremely sense.
Well, and along those lines, since Renee talked about now that places are everywhere, McDonald's, Costco, and kiosks, has there been much thought in retail space of collecting that data and segmenting it out from ordering online? For everywhere from, if they're at a kiosk, you can really measure how quickly they're making decisions. Oh, they deliberated over which color shoes to buy versus to having apps in the store where maybe you are going around and shopping the whole store for clothes, kind of, okay, I picked out the shirt. Now it's going to take me 10 minutes to try. There's a lot of potential opportunity there, but that's probably more subtle than
I think down the road, having something like that is going to be phenomenal, because I struggle with going shopping and trying to find pants, especially with all these variations. You have skinny jeans and straight jeans, and back in the day, you could just buy jeans and you saw what the waist size was, and you can go home with it. Now you can't do that. You could buy it and totally can't fit your legs in it because it's like really skinny. But so that's just kind of my rant. But yeah,
But are people thinking about that now in retail space, or are they really much like lower on the?
I think at the higher level, yeah, but not at like the for example, the North Face. I think they are definitely thinking in terms of how can we really just optimize the process of, if somebody comes online, how we help them get to what they want as fast as and as effective as they can.
Oh, we got. Oh, who? Do rock paper scissors, go.
Really good question. That's a really good question. So the question was, when you're working with retailers, how do you explain the trade-off between, using certain models versus another? Is that kind of what you asked? And this is where you have to be good in sales, because you have to really, first of all, you have to take the time, really understand their business. And once you understand like the true needs of what they're trying to accomplish, whether they're trying to just increase customer engagement or get more return customers, then from there, as you build a model, then you have to really find what's. And so when you think about sales, you break sales down. Sales is about, you're sharing an idea or some model or something with somebody that's a 7 or 8-year-old can understand. Very simple, but it's powerful in terms of the benefit of how you explain it. And I find myself, having to do that a lot, because it's like, if you are it's like me jumping into fencing. I have no idea about what that entails, or the process, or the training. So if somebody explained it to me and the benefits of me doing it one way versus another, they're going to have to really simplify it, because if they don't, then you run down the black hole of confusing them, getting them frustrated, and then kind of pulling back. So the way I approach that is really just taking a lot of time understanding their business, and really understanding, what's the best move for them, and if they even need a model. There's some situations where I've worked with people and what they're trying to do, it doesn't need a model. So yeah, it varies from company to company.
What is the direction which retail is at? First it was brick and mortar, and then was e-commerce, and it is now going to become e-commerce with personal touch. As you mentioned, has the movement of designer background, so it was both e-commerce and it had the personal touch rather than some machine learning model telling to something very customer this do this and that, right? These fits you and all. And asking about is like why if there is a personal touch rather than a machine learning model.
I think it comes. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was gonna say I think it comes down back to like in general, where you're not just doing machine learning on its own doesn't tend to be helpful, right? Like because you can get outputs and then just blindly follow them, but it almost is that combination of having a human counterpart that's already good, a subject matter expert. I think I remember reading books from like the 1980s about some of the first neural networks that they were talking about. And like, even in that book I was reading, they were like, we find that these work best when, you mix it with a subject matter expert and, the machine itself, because, it just adds that little bit of expertise that's kind of missing, right? Like you can put things in and expect numbers out and get complete, random garbage on the other side because you didn't kind of tune it in such a way, right? We're still at a point where we're really having to specify what our algorithms are doing for most people, right? Like it's not completely generalized yet. So you're still kind of having to give it some boundaries and give it some insights that it can't come up with on its own. So I think definitely for the foreseeable future, that combination of taking both, a practitioner of some specialty, like again, like if you're talking about sales, getting a salesman to work with a data scientist, machine learning engineer to develop a feeling of that seamless process, right? Like that's one way. It's like, okay, well, what does it feel like? Well, a machine doesn't know what it feels like, right? Like it only understands if it's increasing sales or decreasing sales, which it might eventually create the process, but it would probably be faster to get someone there and be like, well, it should be like this, typically, exactly. It just adds that other piece that's kind of missing, which is that human piece, right? Like I think it is a necessary component for sure. Yeah, exactly.
So beyond the customer experience, I could see some applications of machine learning. Just
yeah,
like what kind of sizes and shirts are trendy right now. Have you guys run into any kind of like that? That's the thing that predicts versus reality. And then are there any other low-hanging fruit stuff like that beyond the customer experience that
that's a great question. The example I'll give won't be exactly in retail. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm in the motor coach space, which is the big 40 passenger tour buses here throughout Seattle. And one of the things about them, it's all about inventory. You have a 14 passenger bus, you have a 20 passenger bus, you have a 28 passenger bus, and you're always trying to figure out, first of all, can I get enough people to fill this? Am I pricing it at the right price? And is it available? Do I have inventory for that? And one of the things that we did throughout that experience is looked at a lot of the historical data and the patterns and trends and what they're normally pricing things at to determine, based on this given date and time, what should we really charge for a 49 passenger bus, or what should we charge for a 36 passenger bus? So, I mean, I know it's not a retail example, but in terms of it, from an inventory standpoint, does that answer your question, or did I miss the?
No, that answers my
question.
Because it seems to me like predicting how much of certain kind of pants they have, or would use the fancy things to get it there to hold it, and then to get rid of it and bring the other inventories to get up this. And then also another low-hanging fruit seems to be that you want to know what your competitors are pricing versus people at the store to shop for you. So I just wonder if you had like that
Yes.
Oh, I know. God. Sell him oat milk cookies. Oh yeah.
Yeah. I don't have any specific examples that I've worked with that are like that low hanging fruit.
I had an
but-
example of
perfect.
the employee. So, and this is leading more into the motor coach. So, one of the things that they also wanted to figure out how to optimize is, with certain employees, the amount of gas used for a truck, is it higher versus another? So is the maintenance higher versus another, using this employee with this truck for 6 months versus the other one? So it's like those are some of the other like intricate details in the motor coach space that we wanted to figure out. Was there a pattern with this specific guy? For some reason, every truck he touches, the maintenance is like 3 times as high. What's going on with that? So yeah, so definitely those are some of the scenarios that I've seen where it can be really powerful with a company just doesn't have the time to look through thousands of rows of data to figure it out. So
When everyone really can agree on that.
I think I like that one. That was a very fun one, and I think that's another one which is interesting. I think at the bigger level, a lot of bigger corporations are focusing on that, but when you think in terms of like the middle and small, it's not even something that most of the time, and I'm not going to generalize, but a lot of the companies that I've ran into haven't even thought of something like that. But I mean, especially like in a place like Seattle, summer is prime time, and then the winter is kind of a different beast. So being able to, and then with the global warming, that changing, being able to see if you can figure out what is it going to look like for 2019. This year it's really hot. Yeah. So no, that's a great point.
Have you come across a model that's kind of gotten you into maybe trouble when it's limiting use your motor example? It's easy to quantify how much gas an employee uses. But if that employee that uses so much more gas also gives the customer an amazing experience, funnest driver to have on the bus, people love them and they come back. Where you have a model that doesn't really address that variable. You ever come across things where maybe you're quantifying the wrong thing?
I think that's where, like what he was saying earlier, where the domain knowledge comes in, because I mean, the data doesn't have common sense, and machine learning doesn't have common sense. And I'll use another example to kind of talk about that. So the self-driving cars, one of my colleagues, after finishing up with coding school, he was with his girlfriend on the East Coast, and they were in one of the self-driving cars. And the interesting thing that he explained that happened to me was, he got in the car, the experience was great, and what the car was designed to do, or the algorithms that they built in it was designed to do, when there was a car near it, like getting too close, the car would purposely kind of like shift over a little bit to get them to move out of the way. Well, when they were going past semi trucks, it was doing the same thing. So I mean, that's where that common sense, or maybe the domain knowledge, really plays an important part. Yeah, to answer your question, having that domain expert is really important.
Algorithms actually have to actually choose whom to kill sometimes. That can involve some driverless cars, like sometimes it gets people.
Yeah.
Some algorithms that actually affect that. Wow. So that can actually, that's where you can talk about biases. These can be accuracies out of an algorithm. So it's actually pretty okay. Good heavy stuff. Don't think that. person is a father of four. The other person maybe skinnier, maybe
Something about this.
Yeah.
Or do you try to choose the child as a parent?
Yeah.
That oddly enough makes me think of did anyone ever watch iRobot? Yeah, Will Smith, right? Like that was like his big vendetta, right? Like at some point the robot decided to pick him because it predicted he had the 70% chance more of surviving. But I liked your question because you talked about, like, what if that driver is actually doing a really good job? And I think that's that other side of when you start building algorithms. And I brought this up earlier with like providers, you're building when you're building algorithms to kind of predict, is a provider acting the way, like a healthcare provider acting the way they should? Are they providing too much service? Are they providing, are their services even matching up? Like, why are they costing so much? And like, for all they could be doing the right thing, but it's kind of hard to tell just based off the output, right? Like if you have an algorithm that maybe is right at guessing that, okay, they're not doing the right thing 90% of the time, but you tell all 100% of these people that they're doing the wrong thing, and then they change their behavior, that 10% of people now suddenly starts performing worse. Like what does it actually do? So like I think there's a step where you have that information. Now you have to act and figure out why you have that information, and sometimes we don't have that information, right? Like sometimes you don't know the why because you can't see everything, and then you have to, that's where we still have people that are required, where you kind of have to send a person and be like, okay, let's look into it, let's figure out why. Like maybe it's reasonable, maybe it's not. And so that's that other step where sometimes you kind of still need a person involved, because a machine's only going to tell you based on what it knows and based on what you've told it to tell you, basically. So someone
I saw some like.
Thank you. So you touched on this question that, how to determine when a trend is going upward, what products would go viral. I think I'm really fascinated by that question. And I guess, because you mentioned like, something like seasonality is, more predictable, something like if Kylie Jenner posted something, that's probably going to blow up. It's like easy to see. But versus something like fidget spinners, which were one of the biggest viral sensations of last year, and nobody saw that coming, and the few who did became millionaires. So, like, what? I guess my question is like, in the data you work with, have you noticed any patterns or data points that were characteristic of something that eventually became viral before it went viral?
I actually don't know if, like, I'm trying to think. I haven't seen any specific points to that. I don't know if you have. One of my friends at Amazon told me like there was the fidget spinners last year and the solar glasses like broke both of their models to the point where they were like having to explain to people like people were like not believing them what they were getting, and they're like, no, this is just because fidget spinners and solar glasses, right? Like both those things kind of blew things out of proportion. But in a weird way, I'm like, I don't know if they were unpredictable, because I'm trying to remember back then, like maybe like had you been a person like paying attention to like what kids were using, you would have seen it, right? Like it's one of those things where it's like, I'm sure had you gone to a school, you would have seen it coming. Like it's just one of those things. It's like, look, all the kids are doing it. Like eventually everyone's going to be doing it. It's just that weird thing that you kind of have to watch and see, like Pokemon cards or like anything else.
It's kind of like the tipping point. Like,
exactly. Finding that tipping point is probably the hard part. Maybe now that kids are using more and more iPads and stuff, they'll be easier to track. But definitely like adults, I think, produce a lot more data that you don't always see. Like, well, what's happening with the minor? So yeah, I almost want to say I bet you could have seen it had you known to look for it, because some people knew to look for it. Yeah, it's just I think it's one of those things where it's like you have to kind of look and see, and maybe a model would have seen it, but maybe it wouldn't have. Maybe it's just one of those things you kind of have to. Maybe someday in the future it'll be that we're so monitored that, like, yes, the cameras will pick up exactly what 90% of the population is doing, and then, yeah. But no, I don't have a specific point like that, sadly. My long-winded answer.
Yeah, I don't think I have a.
Speaking of small and medium companies, and with very little or sparse data they have, how successful will be their implementing machine learning models when compared to Amazon or Walmart, or even Target. Those are like very big companies, and they have a lot of data. Uh, they do have data specific to each person a lot, when rather than when compared to small and medium companies. How successful do you think they will be implementing a machine learning model in those companies? For example, Amazon would be better recommending products than a small company is. So, uh, in your experience, how do you deal with sparse data in small companies?
How do you deal with sparse data in small companies?
Yes.
It's really a challenge because a lot of times, I mean, you got a couple options. Either if you can find some relevant data, that's thank you. Perfect. So I think that one's really challenging because either you can if you can find some relevant data to that industry or the specific type of retail that they're in, but that's not perfect because obviously is not theirs. And then another option is really launching a campaign to help them figure out how to collect enough data. And then the challenge with that is how fast can they collect the relevant data to really start doing stuff with. So I think not having enough data is also a big challenge in a lot of small and medium-sized companies because they just don't know. They're and again, this goes back to my example about bigger companies are a lot more suited for machine learning algorithms versus small because they've really been thinking about these things for years. And now the world is hearing about all these fancy algorithms like they just came out yesterday, but in reality that's not the case. It's been a process. So I think going back to answer your question, it's possible. It's challenging helping them either find some type of case studies or find some relevant data within the same industry, or really just putting their head down and finding a way to manually get the data. So.
Do you foresee other retailers kind of going the Amazon Go route, like of, you walk in, you have your location thing on, there's no tellers, maybe something like, I don't know, envision like something like in an airport, you just walk in, you grab whatever you need. And because it seems like at retail, the big issue is that there's very little data, right? Unless you sign up, you get like point of sale, but like compared to tech where when you log into the sites, what they're doing on their different pages they view.
I think that one's going to be really challenging. I have heard about a company, one of the partners that we've been working with, they were trying to test this out in grocery stores, and they were using like the GPS location on your phone to which is kind of creepy, I think, in a sense, to track your location in the grocery store and help recommend you to the things that you want. I mean, that's just like, another world of like testing out things. But I think it's going to be really challenging for companies, smaller companies, to even consider getting to that point, if they can. I think that could be a challenge. I couldn't put a timeline or how that would turn out long term.
Do you see any other like big innovation to the retail space in the next 10, 20, 50 years, something like that?
I think seeing a lot of, and this is going back to medium-sized businesses, I think seeing a lot of medium-sized businesses using like machine learning tools just to be effective, because technology is going to get cheaper. Technology is going to get cheaper, so that's going to allow smaller companies to get opportunities. And smaller companies are getting smarter because they're getting exposed to the idea of doing creative things using data or technology. Of course, there's going to be a lot of companies that fail because they, like what he was saying earlier, is jumping the gun and trying to go from A to Z without a process. But there's going to be some companies that are going to figure it out and take their time. And I think you'll just see a lot more smaller companies and mid-sized companies being more effective because they have machine learning tools to help them do that. So.
So I have a question on the GDPR. So my background is not retailing. I've applied machine learning in other areas, typical engineering and sciences. This is my first time hearing about GDPR. As far as I understand, it looks like it's about privacy, right?
Yeah.
And what brought about it, and why is it only for Europeans? And is there anything like that for other parts of the world, like Asia or China? Oh, sorry, or Africa? You have any idea?
So that's a really good question, by the way. I think, and this kind of goes back to, so I mean, now everybody's hearing about the GDPR, but Europe has really been kind of against for years of companies, big companies like Google, getting all this personal information about consumers. In fact, Google's went through a lot of lawsuits just being in Europe in regards to that. And I think we're finally starting to see the results of that they got to the point where they put together this regulation that's supposed to protect consumers. And I mean, to say that is, I would hope that it expands to other countries in a sense. I think it helps protect consumers, like what they're trying to do. I wish it would have came a little earlier, like maybe 10 years ago. I think a lot of companies would be more prepared for it versus now where everybody's really trying to just get into data. But I would like to say I do see it progressing to other countries, partially because it makes it really difficult for anybody that deals with any European citizens to operate. So I was in Europe earlier, well, not this month, but last month, and I was trying to work on some projects for one of my clients, and I tried to access a website that I normally would here, and I couldn't because certain companies are not allowing European citizens to access their website because they haven't figured out what to do with this. So it's I think it's something that's probably going to progress in a long-winded answer.
I think we're about out of time for more questions. If there's like one more, possibly.
I'm curious about how you view your relationship with the companies. Are you a service provider? Do you set up algorithms for them and continue to help them maintain them? Or do you view yourself more as a provider of a product? So you'll build a model for them and then leave them with that, and your relationship ends. They now have this black box that they can continue to use. Or do you kind of get a mix depending on what the customer is looking for?
That's a great question. I like it. The way I started off, and I'll pass it over. The way I started off was just kind of consulting and really just going open-ended and figuring out what type of problems that they have and seeing if it made sense to build an algorithm for it. But sometimes that can be challenging. It takes a lot of time to just start from scratch with every company. And from a scaling standpoint, it can be challenging. So what we've been shifting towards is more of like set type of products and picking out specific niches. And that's part of the reason we transitioned into retail was we saw specific solutions that we could provide. So to answer your question, we did start out very open-ended consulting, and now we've been transitioning into like specific type of products that we want to be experts in, and not because machine learning and data science it's so broad, and I mean it can appeal to any industry that collects data. So to be efficient and effective, it's just really difficult to go that route. So we've been like honing it in and zeroing it into like a specific niche. So.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar to Alex in the sense that I've kind of been trying to focus in more, like when I do consulting, it was definitely like whatever anyone needs, but definitely focusing in. But also, yeah, definitely I like the approach where it's not just a one-time product that you kind of build and then leave them. And it depends on the client, but I've definitely taken on some where it's like, let's build this together. And then, now it's more maintenance, almost like a software product, right? Like now let's work with you. Do you need new things? Because you kind of that opportunity to be like either data analytics as a service or however you want to look at it as a service, but you can kind of tailor it to them. And from a business model standpoint, it works well for you because, then you get something like a retainer or something like that, because you can keep maintaining it, keep providing specific insights for that company, and then you just build this really good relationship. And I think a lot of companies will benefit from that in the future, especially medium-sized companies where it's like, look, you can't afford, to pay someone, a normal salary for all year round, but you can afford to pay for someone for a certain amount of hours, to do machine learning or data analytics. And I think a lot of companies that are maybe not focusing it will benefit from taking on that approach, just because, again, it reduces a lot of your costs and builds a relationship on both sides. So yeah, that's definitely the approach I like to take personally.
Thank you everyone for coming out. I think we have to wrap it up because it's almost 7 o'clock. But we have a few minutes if you still want to hang out and network with each other. And thank you again with Atlas and Alex and Entreprov and Ben. Give them a round of applause. Do you have any final words?
No, just thank you guys for coming out.